Okay, today's sea ice analysis showing ice continuing to advance into the Chukchi Sea here, but warmer southerly winds will slow that advance here, at least for the better part of the upcoming week. And moving on to tonight's weather again, we've got a weakening front still bringing some pretty strong winds into the northern Bering Sea here, but diminishing as it moves along. Less wind down to the south, windy, wet out over the western Aleutians and the Bering Sea there. Light snow at this trough, clear and cold night over much of the southern third of the state, and wind, rain, and snow on the increase here for the southern southeast coast for tomorrow. High wind warnings out for the southern panhandle, winter weather advisories for the central southeast coast for 3 to 6 inches of snow and gusty winds of 30 miles an hour. Blizzard warnings, winter storm warnings out for the northern panhandle for up to 9 to 14 inches of snow, gusty winds of 55 miles an hour. Quarter-mile visibilities and blowing snow, and that pattern shifting over toward Yakutat, increasing winds, Copper River Basin, quite a tight gradient here. And tomorrow afternoon, Matanuska Valley blizzard warning kicks into effect. That lasts through tomorrow night into early Tuesday. Otherwise, fair and cold over the interior, increasing winds even along the Alaska Range where there's a wind advisory out for tomorrow and tomorrow night, but that drops off Tuesday as this whole system pulls westward, northwestward, south of Prince William Sound, and weakens considerably. Stay snowy over the northern panhandle, but rainy with a lot less wind to the south, and mixed precipitation north Gulf Coast. Chance of snow increases south central Alaska, Cook Inlet up into, well, maybe the Matanuska Valley, not so much for the Susitna Valley. Weak trough now brings a chance of light moisture into the southwest coast, and more wind and rain with that system out over the Aleutians. For the coastal water forecast here, very strong winds, storm warnings on the south coast, east-southeast 45 to 50 knots, and high-end storm warnings here for the North Gulf Coast, or for the northern coast here, with east and northeast winds 55 to 65 knots. And Lynn Canal, north winds 40 knots, gale warning Stevens Passage, east winds 40 to 55 knots, and Clarence Strait, southeast winds 40, gusting 55 knots. And for the day on Tuesday, winds really come down now, just gale warnings, all 40-knot winds from the south and southeast on the south coast, east winds 40 knots with gusts of 55 knots on the north coast for Tuesday, and Clarence Strait, southeast at 30 knots, seas 11 feet. Stevens Passage, south winds 40 knots, gusting to 55 knots. And Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, gusting to 45 knots. Prince William Sound, gale warnings for the day on Monday. Northeast winds 35 knots, seas 7 feet. And 30-knot winds here for the North Gulf Coast out of the north, seas 8 feet. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay for north to northeast winds of 40 knots. Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 30 knots. North of the Forelands, though, looking at gusts of 45 knots. And then for the day on Tuesday, Cook Inlet here, north to northeast winds really coming down 15 to 20 knots. Same thing here for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, northwesterlies there, 20 to 25 knots. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, still pretty windy, northeast 40 to 50 knot winds there, north 30 for the western North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 20 knots, seas down to 4 feet. Kodiak Island, gale warnings tomorrow, north to northeast winds 35 knots. Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots. And Bristol Bay, light northeast breeze at 10 knots with 3-foot seas. And then for Tuesday, Bristol Bay, westerlies 15 knots, seas at about 4 feet. Variable winds 10 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island, west-northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow. South to southeast winds 35 knots, and south to southwesterlies 25 to 30 knots for Adak and Atka. Gale warnings for the western Aleutians, southwest 40 to 45 knots. And for Tuesday, gale warnings Adak and Atka, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots, east turning northeast here for the western Aleutians 30 to 45 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. For the southwest coast, tomorrow, southeast winds 30 knots, 45 knot southeast winds for St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George Islands. St. Lawrence Island looking at southeast winds at 25 knots. And for Tuesday, much lighter winds here for the southwest coast out of the east at 10 knots, seas down to 2 to 4 feet, south 15 for the Pribilof, still 12-foot seas there. Southeast 25 with seas just under 20 feet for St. Matthew Island in the northern Bering Sea. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, east winds 15 to 20 knots. Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast tomorrow, that's where the lightest winds will be. Variable 10 to 15 knots. Southeast at 20 knots for the Central Coast. West Coast, south 25 knots. Gale warnings here for the Chukchi Sea. South to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. And for Tuesday, east-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Western Central Arctic Coast, southeast at 15. And the Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast winds east at 10 to 15 knots.